vice president, Vance, and I think Musk and some Republicans in Congress are laying the groundwork, I think, for justifying his ignoring the orders, because what they're claiming is that these court orders themselves are illegal interference with the executive. Now, it's nonsense. That's what courts do in the United States. They decide whether the law allows other people to do things, including the president, including private companies, including Congress. That's the job of the judiciary. And so it's nonsense to say that what they're doing is illegitimate. They may be wrong. I mean, sometimes they get things wrong. And obviously, Trump disagrees with these. But the answer, if you disagree, is to appeal it all the way up to the Supreme Court and then obey the orders along the way, and then obey what the Supreme Court says.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report with me, Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Suzanna Sherry, Professor Emerita at Vanderbilt University Law School and an expert in US constitutional affairs. Suzanna, welcome.
Thank you.
Trump's first month in office has seen a wave of executive orders. He might claim his victory gives him a sort of remit for this, but is there any precedent for these executive orders? And do you think Trump really understands the function they play in US governance?
There's definitely precedent. Every president from George Washington forward has issued executive orders, many of them on their first day in office. The number of orders varies. I think he's issued quite a few, maybe more than most, but he has the authority to issue executive orders. It's not specifically in the Constitution, but as head of the executive branch of the government, he can issue orders to all executive branch officials. So the heads of department, the cabinet secretaries, and so on, he can issue orders to them. Also, Congress has given him the power to issue certain types of orders, for example, certain types of orders on immigration. And he also has some powers that are given to him directly under the Constitution. For example, he is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, so he can issue those kinds of orders. So there's really no problem with a president in general issuing executive orders, but some of the ones he's issued are problematic. Some of them may well be unconstitutional. As to whether he understands, I'm not sure he really cares what the purpose of an executive order is. I think he is trying to make a lot of changes. He's trying to create a lot of buzz and a lot of chaos. And so I don't think he doesn't seem to care whether his orders are constitutional or not, legal or not. And he just does what he feels like.
And as you say, there are questions about the constitutionality of some of those orders. Some of the key executive orders have now been blocked in the courts. Which challenges should we be watching there, and are they likely to be effective?
There's about a dozen courts so far who have paused, that is, issued what's called a temporary restraining order or a preliminary injunction against all or part of about 11 of his orders. There's another 50 or more than 50 lawsuits pending where there haven't been any orders issued yet. And among all of them, some of them are going to be, some of the orders will be upheld, but I do think that some of them will work their way through the courts and ultimately they will be invalidated. And in particular, I think that his attempt to get rid of birthright citizenship is just, as one judge put it, blatantly unconstitutional.
Another key one that we've heard a lot about is Trump's attempt to dismantle USAID. That's been blocked now. Is that one that they could get through in the end?
Probably not without congressional help, because what he's doing essentially, and two different parts of those orders have been blocked. The first one that a judge blocked was laying off workers for USAID. And the second one that was just blocked, I believe, yesterday, is a freeze on using any funds that were allocated. And this implicates something called impoundment. That is, he is impounding funds, not spending them, or ordering them not to be spent, that Congress has allocated for a particular purpose. And in 1974, Congress, in response to essentially President Richard Nixon's attempt to impound fund, Congress passed a statute. I believe it's called the Impoundment Control Act, that says a president cannot impound the money. If we, the Congress, say this is how the money should be spent, the president must spend it. And the Supreme Court has hinted, they haven't held specifically, but they have hinted that even without that statute, impoundment would violate the Constitution because it is Congress's job to determine how money should be spent. So that one is probably going to make it all the way to the Supreme Court. And I would guess that between the statute itself and the Constitution, he will not be allowed to impound money. He will have to spend the money as Congress directs it to spend. Now, of course, Congress could pass a new law that says, no, you don't have to spend money on U.S. aid. I don't know if the Republicans want to do that, and I don't know if they could get that one through.
And the US Supreme Court has previously ruled, I suppose Trump would see, previously ruled favorably for him on a few issues. I mean, not least that sort of presumptive immunity for US presidents' actions. But how many of these issues could actually end up in the Supreme Court, and how would they get there? How big of a task would that be for the court to deal with?
I think many of them will get there. I don't know exactly how many, because there's new lawsuits every day. There's new orders every day. The way it works is, so far all we have is the federal district courts, the trial level courts, have been issuing mostly these preliminary injunctions, somewhat while they're deciding the case. So the cases have to go forward in the trial court, and the lawyers on both sides will make arguments, and the judge will decide whether to issue a permanent injunction. That is to say, no, you may not enforce this executive order. At that point, Trump will appeal to our intermediate appellate level, called the circuit courts or the courts of appeals, and those courts will decide whether he can issue those orders. And then if he loses there, he will petition the Supreme Court to hear the case. And unlike the courts of appeals, the U.S. Supreme Court doesn't have to hear any case it doesn't want to. So I suspect that the Supreme Court would want to hear all of these cases because they're important. They're about presidential power. So no matter how it comes out in the end, it's something that the Supreme Court should decide. And I think the fact that he got immunity, there are problems with that opinion. I don't think it's totally wrong. I think parts of it are wrong, but I don't think we should take it as a signal that this court is just going to lay down and die in front of him. They, especially I think Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Barrett, they're lawyers. They're lawyers, and they are careful about the law. And so I think on some of them, for example, I keep coming back to the birthright citizenship case because it's so easy. I think the court, by at least a 7-2 majority, and maybe unanimously, will hold that order trying to get rid of birthright citizenship is, in fact, unconstitutional.
This level of executive orders, the amount here, and the issues they deal with, as you say, more importantly, I mean, has the Supreme Court had to act in this capacity before? As in, has it ever faced this amount of executive orders that it might have to, or cases that it might have to deal with in one go? How big of an event could this be for the Supreme Court, I suppose, is what I'm getting at here?
Well, I think they're going to reach it slowly. That is, each trial court might take a longer or a shorter time to issue the permanent injunction, or not issue, or say they weren't going to issue one. And then each of the circuit courts is basically on a different schedule. Some of them are fairly quick. Some of them there's a long time between the time you appeal and the time you actually get heard, and then another long time before the court issues its opinion. So these are going to trickle into the Supreme Court probably over the years, although it may get there fairly quickly in terms of asking the court to lift these injunctions. But the court doesn't have to do that. The court, and probably won't. The court, I think, would probably rather keep the status quo, where the district courts have said, no, you can't change everything all at once. And the Supreme Court will say, okay, we're going to let you say that. We'll wait and we'll hear the case when it comes up to us. We're not going to interfere now. They have the power to do that. That is, Trump could go from the district court to the Court of Appeals, and if both of those courts still stay his orders, that is, still have temporary injunctions against his orders, he can appeal that to the Supreme Court and ask them to lift the stay.
And we mentioned before that sort of presumptive immunity for US president's activities. Presumably that does not extend much further than Trump himself. I mean, it wouldn't cover his entire administration and the people who are working for it.
No, it's only the president, and it is, I think, only criminal prosecutions, that particular case.
I mean, I mention that in part because, the other element to a lot of these legal challenges that Trump's team face is DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. Musk himself is now facing lawsuits. How has that come about?
Well, there are two lawsuits against Musk and DOGE. One of them says that giving him and his employees, who are not government employees and have not been vetted and have not been given security clearances, that giving them access to sensitive private information, including bank records and social security numbers and that sort of thing, that violates a federal statute called the Privacy Act. So that's one lawsuit. I'm not sure how that one will turn out because it's a very complicated act. The other lawsuit basically says he can't be making these decisions at all because he has not been properly appointed. The Constitution says that officers of the United States, and this has been narrowed to what they call principal officers, cabinet secretaries and the like. Those officers are nominated by the president but have to be confirmed by the Senate. And if he is exercising the authority of a principal officer, which it sort of looks like he is, then he can't do that because he has not been confirmed by the Senate. There are then something called inferior officers, which the Constitution says Congress can decide how they can be appointed. And Congress could give that authority to the president, it could give it to the courts, could hold it for itself. But there is no statute that authorizes the president to appoint somebody like Musk to do DOGE. And so there's the lawsuit alleges both that he is a principal officer and therefore he can't do anything at all because he hasn't been confirmed. And if he's not a principal officer, then he's an inferior officer, but he's not statutorily appropriately appointed under statute.
And as you said, that DOGE itself also appears to sort of fallen foul of the courts there. It's been blocked from accessing Treasury Department records and systems. There are other challenges as well. They seem keen to kind of carry on going through different departments to clear out what they claim is fraud or inefficiency. Can they? Does this set a precedent to kind of slow DOGE at all, or can they just carry on and kind of ask these legal questions later?
Well, it depends on the particular court and the order that it issues. The orders that have been, I mean, the court orders that have been issued so far pertain only to Treasury. And because we have a system of 94 different district courts that are independent of each other, the fact that one court has said you can't do this for Treasury doesn't mean that another court is going to follow that precedent. But I think the suit that says, so that the Treasury suits were fairly particular because the government was accessing, or DOGE was accessing, certain kinds of information and was locking out the employees and was freezing payments. So that was about Treasury. The lawsuit that's been filed now that says he can't do any of this, that's much broader. So a court issuing an injunction against that would probably stop him from doing any of it, assuming that he and Trump obey the court orders.
And there's also been, I mean, as you say, that question about will they obey court orders? Will Trump's team obey the courts? Where are we with that?
Well, Trump has said he will, and he did during his first term. But others, including the vice president Vance, and I think Musk, and some Republicans of Congress, are laying the groundwork, I think, for justifying his ignoring the orders, because what they're claiming is that these court orders themselves are illegal interference with the executive. Now, it's nonsense. That's what courts do in the United States. They decide whether the law allows other people to do things, including the president, including private companies, including Congress. That's the job of the judiciary. And so it's nonsense to say that what they're doing is illegitimate. They may be wrong. I mean, sometimes they get things wrong. And obviously, Trump disagrees with these. But the answer, if you disagree, is to appeal it all the way up to the Supreme Court and then obey the orders along the way, and then obey what the Supreme Court says.
And this conflict between Trump's team and the courts, through DOGE and through some of these executive orders that have been challenged, it's being termed by some a constitutional crisis. Do you think we are at that point yet? Or does this sort of change come with the administrations in general, especially one as dramatic as Trump's?
I don't think we're at a constitutional crisis yet, because so far they are obeying the orders. Now, there was some problem about the freezing the funds, and a judge, I think it was in uh, Massachusetts, or maybe it was in Rhode Island. One federal judge. Let me start this again. I don't think we're at a constitutional crisis yet, because so far he's obeying the orders. Now, there was some concern. One of the judges, the one who said he couldn't freeze federal money generally, has now issued a second order saying, we have information that you are still freezing some of these monies, and you'd better stop. And if he doesn't let all that money go, then the judge is probably going to have to hold him in contempt, and that might trigger a constitutional crisis. But the bigger threat is that he will simply ignore some of these orders, and if he does, that's a constitutional crisis. And we've seen this twice in our history. First, when Andrew Jackson was president, and he wanted to remove the Cherokee tribe from where they were and move them west to Oklahoma, and the Supreme Court, then led by Chief Justice John Marshall, said he couldn't do that. That would violate the Constitution, and Jackson, this is apocryphal, but it's something he would have said. He didn't, but he could have. He said, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. And he did, in fact, go ahead and remove the Cherokee. That was in 1836. That was a long time ago, and the Supreme Court was still sort of weak. Among other things, in the first 5 years of the Supreme Court, they had 3 different Chief Justices, because it wasn't a very good job. They got there and then they got a better job. They just left. So the Supreme Court wasn't what it is today. So that it wasn't really a constitutional crisis, but we've at least seen it happen. The second time was with Richard Nixon, when the court ordered him to turn over the Watergate tapes that were going, in fact, to implicate him in the Watergate burglary. He talked about maybe he wouldn't obey such an order, but in the end, he obeyed it and resigned. He did not trigger a constitutional crisis. So I don't know. Like I said, we've seen this before. The first time it didn't lead to a constitutional crisis because the Supreme Court backed down. The second time it didn't lead to a constitutional crisis because the president backed down. Not clear who, if anyone, is going to back down this time.
Is there any sign that Trump's administration knew they were going to face this sort of challenge from the courts in America? Were they prepared for this, do you think?
I don't think they cared. And there is some speculation that in fact he's doing it deliberately because he thinks the Supreme Court will side with him, in part because he did win the immunity case. Now, what he may have forgotten is that he lost some cases in his first term. The Supreme Court, even his Supreme Court, uh, um, denied some of his claims. Also, some of the lower court judges that he appointed ruled against him in his stolen election claims. In fact, every judge who decided a case that determined whether there had been any chicanery in the election, every judge rejected the claim, said the election was full and fair and not a problem, including several of the judges he had appointed. So I think he's a little optimistic if he thinks he can win just because he's appointed these judges.
Well, Suzanna Sherry, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.